Hi, everybody.
Hi, Stephen.
Good day, Stephen.
Hi,
Stephen.
I've got to open it first. Okay, there. Share screen. And then we do that. Right, there we go. So it's 12 o'clock. Welcome to everyone. We've just got David still to join us, but he's only on a little later, so we'll do that. So welcome to Viraj and Clive and Stephen, talking on our 5th webinar in the SAFMA sequence, which was started as arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. What we're talking about today is fire certification, a certification for fire, or fire prevention and detection. And then that'll be the first part of it. Let's run down. So it's welcome to everyone. Right. So it's the 5th local and international. Last week we had some international speakers from Dubai. So we're looking at fire compliance, managing alcohol sanitizers, which will be the second part of the fire discussion. And then the third part today is fogging as a sanitizing activity. Now, lots of talk on fogging, and talking to the team yesterday, we then find there are 2 types of fogging, one of which is using an alcohol-based fog. We'll discuss that as part, and it sits between managing alcohol and managing fogging using an alcohol-based fogger as a sanitizer. And then, as always, questions and answers. Welcome. We run this on an interactive basis, so questions are, and answers are welcomed. So who we've got today is we've got Clive Ford and Viraj Panchu, who are from the Fire Detection Installers Association, which is the FDIA, and they will talk to us, just tell us a bit about that. And then later on the fogging, we've got all the way from sunny Cape Town, David Wilson, who runs a business called ProClean Services. And he's obviously, because he runs a business, he's a specialist in fogging. And part of this fogging goes to the discussion we had previously on air conditioning, because one of the things you do when you fog is that fogging is sucked up into the air conditioning. So again, we start to close a loop on from COVID, looking at sanitizing, air conditioning, and the total facilities service and the total facility as a single entity. And then with me joining me as well is Stephen Malloy, and he's with SAFMA as one of the SAFMA directors. So I think let's start off, and what I'll do is we've got this running and it's up on the screen, but I'm going to switch this off. People are saying that they actually don't want to see the screen. They actually want to see who's talking and what the speakers look like. So we're going to start off with fire safety and certification. And I don't know who's going to start off, Clive or Viraj, talking about, and so the question that's sort of posed that started this discussion is we have a range of buildings, from new buildings, which may have rational fire design, and nominally you hope when you've had a rational fire design, and as an FM, you've just taken over the building, where that places you, or you've got an older building and you ask someone to come in and certify your building from a fire perspective. What does it mean? What are the risks? And who's at risk? So guys?
Um, Good day. All right, I'll start off.
Right.
Varag is joining me. So my name's Clive Ford. I'm representing the FDIA at the moment, which is the Fire Detection Installers Association. I'm the chairman there, and I've been for the last three or 4 years, I think it is. Basically, what we are is a voluntary group of contractors and suppliers that formed many years ago, probably about 22 years ago, that we got together because there was no standards available in South Africa at that point for fire detection. So after many meetings and lots of backwards and forwards, it was decided that we'd adopt the British standards so that we got some kind of standard to start from, that we're not just starting in the dark with just sucking stuff out the air. That was sanified, I think is the right terminology. So that's been adopted, and over the years we've managed to get it that people are in general using the SANS 10139 standard for fire detection. There are other standards, and there's standards for buildings and so on. We work under the SANS 10400, which gives us the background for what is required in fire detection. Part T covers specifically fire detection, and Part W covers the sprinkler side, which we touched on slightly yesterday. Varag is the liaison officer, so he's going to be more up to speed with exactly where we are on the standards and so on. And so that's where we're going to start from. Where we came in is that we had a discussion about 2 weeks ago with John, that the biggest issue that you guys have got is that people come into your building and say, your building's not compliant, you're gonna have to spend millions of rand to make it compliant. And there's no background of what you understand as being compliant and what we see as being compliant. So that's why we're here today, is just to have an open-ended discussion and give you a bit of background on what the detection side of it, detection and suppression side of it is covered. If there's any questions on the ASIP side, that's not our speciality, but we can answer, or we can take questions away and then come back to you and give you some kind of feedback on that. So I think that's about all that I can say. Varag is he's got a couple of points that he's made notes of questions that were asked yesterday and previously. We can go from there, and if you've got any questions, shout and stop us, because it's the first time I've done something like this, so it's new for all of us.
Yep. Thank you, Clive. Good day, everyone. Virag Panchu. I'm the liaison officer for FDIA. Essentially, based on the mandate or the request, what we just want to do at a very high level is talk about compliance and what compliance means in the space. Essentially, we have the building regulation, which is SANS 10400, which is mandatory. It's prescriptive, and that as the standard which everyone needs to comply to from building design, construction and maintenance perspective. Also then alludes to various other standards such as SANS 10139, which looks at detection, and various others. So the SANS 10139 and other standards are presented as recommendations, and as such are often treated as recommendations and not absolute. And there is a bit of a problem with that, because the prescription comes from SANS 10400. The guideline is within SANS 10139. And essentially, if you are, from a detection perspective, and that also applies to many of the other non-prescriptive standards, the recommended standards, if you like, that intend to give you the framework within which to design, maintain your various installations. At a very high level, SANS 10400 looks at the protection of occupants, including people with disabilities, spread and intensity of fires, control of spread and intensity of fires within the buildings, and the intention is to minimize that. to provide sufficient stability from the building structures perspective, so as to not endanger other buildings adjacent to your premises. And then it looks at the generation and spread of smoke and fire, and how to, well, like I said, how to minimize that and to reduce to the greatest extent reasonably practicable the development of such smoke and fire. Also, to provide adequate means of access for fire services and for provision of detection equipment, firefighting equipment, and controlling and extinguishing such fires, as well as for the maintenance, provision of maintenance for all these services. These are the things that are stipulated within SANS 10400. The detail of it is available within the SANS 10139 for detection, 14520 for gas suppression systems, and there's a whole host of them that cover the specifics of each discipline. And to give you an idea of how many disciplines you're talking about, I mean, it extends from protection of openings, tenant separations, fire resistance, fire performance, emergency routes construction, fire exit doors, feeder routes, internal finishes, basements constructions, width of escape routes, stairways, pressurization of emergency routes, ventilation of stairwells, openings in floors and ceilings, lobbies and foyers, means of construction, and it goes on, hoses, hydrants, water reticulation, sprinkler systems, portable handheld extinguishers, and it really continues to warehousing of dangerous goods, and et cetera, et cetera. Where the 10400 gives certain guidelines at a high level, it also alludes to or points to other standards which give much more detailed specifics in that area of specialization. And the reason we're just covering it in that fashion is because we're going to try and demonstrate that the fire industry space is not just the one discipline, and there are many specialists out there that are working in the space of ventilation, detection, suppression, and these are small parts of the entire package. It's important to understand that where you have particular requirements, you need to seek out the specialists in those fields and address the requirements in accordance with, those parameters from those specialists. Having said that, there are registration authorities, registration bodies that are mandated by the Department of Labor within the fire detection and the fire space. One of these bodies is SAQCC, the South African Qualifications Committee and Certification Committee, and they have currently a huge database of members, individuals and companies who are registered on various levels to perform various fire-related specialized functions. In the detection space, I think we've got over 3,000 persons registered as installers, cablers, commissioners, designers on the detection and on the gas side. So I think the approach to take is to make sure, first of all, that your installations that are being done by properly approved and certified individuals. Part of the installation requirements is to have a decent handover document with certificates that includes a design certificate, an installation certificate, a commissioning certificate, a handover or approval certificate for this, acceptance certificate for the system. And then for ongoing maintenance, you need to appoint an appropriately approved and certified maintenance organization. And there must also be a history kept of any deviations as well as modifications carried out to a system. This is something that has not necessarily been catered for very well, and often we find when taking over or when asked to take over buildings maintenance, you arrive on site and you don't have any reference. If there's a rational fire design that's been conducted on the premises, it's nowhere to be found, and the maintenance team is expected then to come up with something. And it's very difficult under those circumstances, and often it's the starting point for the kind of difficulty John was speaking about, where someone says, you're not compliant. It's also a problem because I think the legislation doesn't cover beyond storing the information for the rational fire design at the local authority, any other means of record keeping. So as facility management companies, perhaps one of the priorities should be developing within the building or for the building the safety plan, and the safety plan should include all the necessary designs and certification and approvals for the various systems that make up your fire safety and your premises protection plan. And I mentioned some for the detection space. The same applies for sprinklers, for the handhelds. And you'll find that you need to build these up into a portfolio that extends to your method of operation, your modus operandi for emergency action. If you have a fire in your building, if you have any sort of emergency in your building, what is your response plan? And then it extends to your trained staff, etc., etc. And it's quite a comprehensive, the intent is quite comprehensive when it comes to the fire safety plan for the building. But I think it's something that a lot of buildings and organizations fall short of. That should be perhaps your starting point for compliance. Yes.
Viraj, we're running on time. Let's ask the question, if you're not compliant, what are you not compliant with? Just answer that quickly. We're running on time here.
Okay,
so you're not compliant with, and then the question is, well, so what?
John, okay.
Absolutely.
What would happen is if we come, well, okay, I'm talking as a contractor now. We come into the building to do maintenance on the building. If there's no design document for the building, then we're going to obviously have to assume that the building has been designed to a certain level.
Right.
We then use that to come back to you and say, we see that your building is a office block. According to the SAN standard, this is what you require for an office block. And this 0.1234 is your building is not compliant to that standard. If you have a design certificate from a rational designer and they say that we've designed 1, 2, and 3, then we would have that to go back to and say, all right, it's not compliant to the SAN standard, but it's compliant to a rational design. Where people use the rational design as a shortcut a lot is that rational designs should be put in place when the building is used to an effect that it cannot be covered by the standard. So we use, in general, for detection 10139, and that covers many, many things. But you might have a really specialized building that is not covered within those standards. Then you could use a rational design. However, the rational design still needs to be within the spirit of what the 10139 requires. So if your supplier is selling, or your service provider is saying to you, your building is not compliant, he can't just say your building is not compliant. He should be giving you a report and saying there's no smoke detectors in the lift lobbies, there's no manual call points at your fire escapes, and so on. He must be able to prove to you why it's not compliant.
Okay, so if it's not compliant,
against what is measured as, sorry.
If it's not compliant, do I get shut down, or is it an insurance issue?
So if I...
Okay.
Okay, so if I may, so there's various approaches to take. First of all is who's responsible. And it becomes very tricky, especially in your space where you are managing facilities for a tenant where there's another landlord or landowner. Is effectively the owner of the property is responsible, and they are permitted to delegate that responsibility to someone else provided it's done in writing. That can take the form of a lease agreement, for example, which then specifies that the tenant takes ownership of all fire safety responsibilities within the premises and to whatever extent that happens. In the absence of such an agreement, it falls back to the owner of the building. But then you need to go back to whatever that source document is, which defines who the responsible person is. And that person must be advised of the risks, and they can be liable in the event of not complying, and have the building shut down potentially, depending on the level of risk. Remember, there is a provision within the code of practice and from the local authority to allow certain deviations and to permit, certain things that don't comply fully with the standard, provided these things have been qualified and there's some sort of mitigation process in place that maintains the level of protection. But if it's just blanketly left out and there's a risk and there's a potential risk to life, that liability falls back to whoever the responsible person is.
Okay, Stephen, you got a comment, and then we'll close this aspect. Stephen, you're on.
Yes, thanks, John. The answer to the question, what standard do you have to comply to, is a very good one. And for older buildings where I'm involved in, which is 20 years, 40 years old, the standards written in those days are much simpler than the rational fire design standards of the new National Building Regulations. So if you have an older building that complied 40 years ago, and you do not change the internals, you are still by letter of the law compliant. Right. But once you change the internals of a building, you suddenly have to comply to the new fire regulations of SANS 10400. So yes, there's different standards for different ages of buildings. And the rule of thumb is when you do major upgrades in a building, you suddenly have to apply the new fire standards. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
So
yeah.
let's close that one. Then the next topic. There's a whole lot of alcohol outside of bottle stores, right? That's used for hand sanitizers, and this stuff is 70% proof, which we are storing in the buildings. We're storing it in stores. We're storing it on a shelf. I've got some in my kitchen. And we are spraying it liberally around shopping centers and anywhere else. Some people are buying it in bulk and then decanting it quite happily. And if we said to them, listen, this stuff is actually petrol, people would be a little more wary of it. If we said to them, listen, this stuff isn't petrol, it's something much worse than petrol because it explodes more easily. And has a wider explosive limit, should we say that? What should we be doing looking at storing it? So, and what are the characteristics? So if we ask Viraj or Clive, looking at the amount of alcohol, which is the same stuff that we drink, only it's a lot stronger because it's 70%, and your whiskey is only 43%. What sort of precautions should we be looking at?
So, right, John, the first thing that, and I'm going to give it to Viraj to give you the more nitty-gritties of it. The first thing that your suppliers should be doing is you need to ask them for the data sheet, the safety data sheet of the solution that you're using. On that, it's going to indicate what your volatility of the solution is. And from there, it then gives you limits, and Viraj's got all the limits with him, limits of how much you can store in one place without having specialized storage areas. Viraj, you want to just fill up there?
So I think this is critical because we don't actually know what the composition of the hand sanitizers and the mixtures that have been presented as hand sanitizers actually constituted of. And the standard calls for under 10400 A20, which is talking about the categorization of the premises. High hazard flammable storage or storage of high hazard flammable liquids puts you into a J1 category. If you do not exceed 4 liquids or for liquids that have a flash point greater than 40 degrees Celsius, you are not permitted to exceed 200 liters. That's 200 liters if the flash point is above 40 degrees Celsius. If it is below 40 degrees Celsius, the flash point of that liquid, that hand sanitizing is less than 40 degrees Celsius, then you are not allowed to keep more than 40 liters on the premises. So that's a very small number. If you're going to keep these type of quantities, they talk about provision of storage cabinets and the storage cabinets available go up to 200 liters. But even in those instances, those storage cabinets are not meant to keep 200 liters of material in there, actually just for storage of smaller quantities for use in, for example, laboratories, etc., where you have a separate store that meets the storage criteria for flammable equipment, which means you need to have the proper bunding, the proper fire constructions, ventilation, as well as provisions for decanting and separation of those liquids within those storage spaces. And there's quite a bit of detail around construction of that. But short answer is 40 degrees Celsius flash point. If it's less than 40 degrees Celsius, 40 liters is the maximum. If it's a flash point greater than 40 degrees Celsius as a flammable, maximum is 200 liters. Anything above 200 liters requires a properly constructed room. In any event, you should have a properly constructed room, even up to 200 liters.
Okay, so if we look at...
Your data sheet is very critical, that your suppliers need to give you the data sheet, then you can work around that.
Okay, but I mean, if we just take a general look at it, alcohol would normally have a flash of less than 40.
Yes, just before the meeting, I had done a quick search on surgical spirits, and that's got a flash point of 15 degrees.
Okay, so I mean, to the general FM who's sitting around listening to this and says, okay, so I've got this whole data sheet and all the rest of it, and yeah, I can look at it and whatever, but actually that's not where I play. The general comment would be, if you're working with hand sanitizers that have got a high alcohol content, 70 degrees, you can, unless someone tells you otherwise, you can assume that this stuff sits below 40 degrees C, is probably 15 degrees. We know that alcohol's got a wider explosive limit than petrol. We know that it gathers in low spots. If you look, I come out of the petrol industry. If you're going to store that sort of stuff, you need flame-proof room. You need good ventilation. If you're going to be decanting it, you will be having vapor flowing around. If there's any little step in the room, it'll gather at that step, or in a sump or a low spot, it'll all gather there. And if it does burn, you can't see the flame. So with a petrol flame, you can nice yellow flame. Diesel, lots of black smoke. Alcohol, you can't see it. It's extremely dangerous. So what the law says is no more than 40 liters. And if you spill it on you, you've got to get that clothing off you. So what we're saying is that this stuff is extremely dangerous.
Absolutely.
And, yeah.
I think
and therefore, we are then stacking it around the building, what do you think there's an insurance notification that we should be putting out to, if we start storing this sort of significant volumes on site?
Look, if you're going to be storing significant volumes, then you need to provide for the regulated or the specified environment for storage that's having a properly constructed building that's separated from the main building, like you said, with the proper fire doors, walls, ventilation, bunding, raised step floor to be able to hold any spilled liquid, etc. That should be provided for, especially if this is going to be an ongoing situation. The way it looks now, I think if something lasts for more than 3 months, you have to start treating it like a permanent situation. Even if you say 6 months, and I think we're going to go over 6 months with the current state of affairs. So provision should be made for proper storage and handling of such materials, and staff need to be trained, because there's a level of comfort, because everyone's spraying it on their hand. There's a level of comfort around this. They need to be made aware of the risk associated with these flammable liquids.
Okay, the other thing I think we need to pick up with is that alcohol mixes with water. So you end up then with let's say you mix it 50-50, you now have a 35% maybe solution, whereas with petrol it floats on the top. So if you have a spill, don't just wash it down the drain. because all you're doing is pushing the problem somewhere else. So I think the storage and handling of alcohol needs some specialist advice. And I'm certainly where people are getting large 20, 25 litre drums and are then storing it and then decanting it, I think that we need to be very careful with what we're doing here. Otherwise, we're going to get a nasty bang. And we're certainly not geared up generally for this. So it's a concern. Okay, guys, thank you very much. David, we're going to talk about fogging, and you can also then talk about, if you can talk about the range of fogging, one of which I believe is, as I heard yesterday, is an alcohol fog. So not only are we storing this stuff, we're now putting it in a fog, which is interesting, and then vaporizing it and spraying it around the building. So maybe you'd like to talk about fogging in general and your fogging. So David's from ProClean, talking to us. You can see he's generally ready for the beach in Antarctica by the looks of it. David.
No, it's quite cold here in Cape Town. I must say we've got a storm on our hands here, but the other storm is actually bigger than the weather, and this is the COVID-19. It's I'm sure you're aware of the havoc it causes in Cape Town currently. The clinics phoned us last night at 10. The new thing is the guys are infecting each other just to be off work. That's a new thing, to stay at home. So yeah, that's but yeah, back to thermal fogging. So it originally started in Wuhan, using the fogger as a disinfectant. So foggers is normally used as a pesticide to control insects. But now what they do is they basically throw a disinfectant in the chemical tank, and it vaporizes the chemical with the heat. So it floats in the air, and it causes to disinfect the premises or the rooms. What I've read so far is there's a few different types of fogging, and the one I explained now is the thermal fogging. The other one is the ULV fogging. It's a cold fogging. But the difference between the two, and what they say is it's safer to use the ULV fogging inside as the thermal fogging. The thermal fogging is a dry method. ULV fogging is a cold method, but the consequences on the ULV is the particles is much larger, so it causes more damage to if there's paper lying around and so forth. And you can't always see where you fog with a ULV fogger. Where the thermal fogger is, it can cover large areas in smaller time, or in less time to disinfect large places. So, but now what we found these days is where the thermal fogger and the machine that we use is petrol based. But I just must mention to you guys, seeing that we're looking at the fire brigade, the thermal fogger is much more efficient. So we tend to use that much easier in large places. But when it comes to small places, what is happening now in the market is they put an alcohol-based sanitizer in a canister of basically this large, and they disinfect the office with that canister, because everybody now knows if the sanitizer contains alcohol-based, it kills the virus. So now they put that alcohol in a fogger and disinfect. So I can't imagine what you guys are going to struggle with in buildings with a fogger that goes off with a 70% alcohol base. But that's not the point here. The thermal fogging that we use is it depends on the chemical that you throw into that fogger. So I think what is most important, we all know that, well, not we all, I've read a few articles with the Health Organization. It states chloride is the other chemical that kills the virus. So that's mainly what we use currently to add to our tank and to the thermal fogger to disinfect the place. I'm not sure about, I've got the MSDS here and the safety sheets, but I think it's safe to say it's not fire hazard compared to the alcohol-based one. But in thermal fogging, yeah, that's the most efficient way to go to disinfect the premises currently in what we do. So yeah, that's basically it.
Okay, so we haven't blown the building up because we're not using alcohol and fogging that. We'll come back to that point in a second. But now you're putting chlorine in and you're fogging with chlorine. What has anyone looked at what the corrosion effect is using that?
Yeah, it is on a data sheet. It's non-corrosion. But before I'm going to state something, I just want to open my MSDS on this. But what I understand, it's quite safe, and we send all the documentation out before we go into a building so that the facility manager is quite aware of what we do. I must also just state, when we start fogging, the smoke detectors must be disabled while we're doing it. Otherwise, it will set off smoke detectors. So that's also just to mention on the fogging side, the bats, they basically disable the fire alarms so that we can continue working. But yeah.
Okay, so for the everyone out there, so when you're doing your fogging, the first thing you need to do is disconnect, switch off the fire detectors. So now, from a vulnerability point of view, you have a building with no, or an area in a building, maybe not the whole building, an area in a building that has no fire detection while you're doing the fogging, for obvious reasons. But I mean, that's a risk. And part of the risk assessment you need to do for this fogging is you need to, A, be aware that it's a risk, and B, you need to take the mitigating steps so that you've got people around watching the building while you're doing the fogging to make sure that we don't have any fire accidents, because you're not going to pick it up. Okay, David?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I just want to state also that, yeah, I haven't noticed, I don't know what the effects or the effects of the alcohol canister is, or fogger in the canister is. I don't know if they ever need to switch off the fire alarm or the smoke detectors. But we normally, if we go in, we inform everybody about the fogging, and obviously then they switch off the smoke detectors, and we basically there for 20 minutes, and after an hour they only can switch off or switch back on the fire detectors and the smoke detectors.
Okay, so from an insurance point of view, Marianne's just put it out. Insurance needs to know, they need to be alerted that you're going to switch the fire detectors off. I don't know the alcohol fogging, and therefore I'm speaking without that, whether the alcohol is the propellant or whether the alcohol is like your, a lot of the sprays that you use, the propellant is actually unquenched, not quenched, LPG. So it's LPG that hasn't been got a smell in it, and they use that as the propellant. Now, whether that's the propellant on your alcohol or not, goodness knows. But I hope that LPG is not the propellant. But if we're spraying a vapor of alcohol into an area in any form or description, I mean, this is a huge, huge fire risk. any spark from any switch, contactor, or anything else that should spark that volume of alcohol, given that the alcohol has got a broader band of explosive limits than petrol. I think that there's a question that I will ask myself for the panelists. What is the danger that we're facing with alcohol-based fogging? And I don't know the answer, but certainly it's something we will need to do some research on. And then we'll come back at one of the other webinars, question and answers, and we'll answer that one. But just sitting here, it would make me would make me extremely nervous. David, got a comment?
I think the main thing here is, like I said, the focus is COVID-19, and that's where they tend to forget about, or not to forget. It's just all the procedures is going out of the front door and just disinfect. Focus on that. And I think everybody needs to be, especially the facility manager, needs to be aware of this, and just keep everything in mind that what we do is hazardous to the building. But obviously the focus is then to do the COVID-19, to disinfect for that. And just to keep in mind that you've got issues around your building that you need to protect before we go in there, and to inform everybody that needs to be informed. Just keep in mind, we always send the MSDS and all the chemical stuff to the facility manager, so he's quite aware of what it contains and what we work with. We give the procedure, questions and answer, everything goes out to him before we go on site. So from that point of view, the facility manager or building manager in that scenario is informed. Yeah. And
okay,
then,
so to the participants to this seminar, you are hereby blessed with a PhD in chemistry, because you get the data pack of all the chemical composition of all the chemicals being used. I think that we need to come back to the guys with some guidelines on this, certainly from an explosive point of view, from fire, and from a corrosive point of view. You know, I acknowledge that that's passed on, but that the information is provided. But I think if I get one of those data sheets, I'm not sure know necessarily what I'm looking at. And so I think one of the things SAFMA will pick up, if we could with David, is get those data sheets, and we'll get it checked out, and that will go up on our web as a layman's explanation to what for me would be quite a complicated set of data.
yeah, I think
sorry, yes.
At this stage, there's not much guidelines in what to use with the thermal fogger.
Right.
We're quite aware of the certain chemical can disinfect the virus, but you can use different type of chemicals. That's the point. And nobody, and it's like you said, there's no professional out there or facility manager that's got a PhD in reading the data sheet. So he can't say, listen, this is hazardous for the building. He's just going to focus and say, listen, I've heard this is a disinfectant for the COVID. Please go ahead. That's certain buildings, but obviously you've got your Coca-Cola, your spa shops that's quite aware of what does the MSDS contains and what is allowed and what is food safe. Yeah. So that helps a lot. But your building manager, your normal, your plain small office is just going to say, listen, please go ahead.
No, we absolutely agree. So if we can ask you, if we can get the chemical composition and get it'll be a SAFMA information guideline. It's not SANS standards, but at least we can provide our members a bit of guidance as to what they're looking at the different types of fogging, hot fogging, cold fogging, and and the sanitizing. So we can look at that. Stephen, you got a question? Stephen? No, you've frozen. Okay.
Hi, sorry about
Sorry,
that.
yes, Stephen?
I couldn't find the unmute button.
Technology, buddy. Right,
Yes.
you got a question?
A question was asked by one of the people on the group, the webinar, stating that certain of the bodies across the world don't support fogging. It was is there any response from David regarding that statement?
No, I must say I'm not quite aware of that. All I've read so far and what we know is that fogging is the most efficient way to disinfect. It's the quickest way and it's the most efficient because it covers all the areas. The chemical vaporize in a 0.5 microparticle that make the floating time much longer. So it goes all over, and that's what you want. Because if you get a guy that does the deep cleaning, and I've been in the cleaning business for 12 years now, or 10 years, if you do deep cleaning, you've always got the human factor that's going to miss something. And we all know about this COVID-19, it's contagious and it's very alive on the surface. So you can't afford to miss anything. So that's where the fogging works so much better, to make sure every surface is covered and every wall or everywhere the guy sneezes, it's covered. And that's why I say the thermal fogging is currently the most efficient way that we aware of. Others than that, I haven't heard.
Okay. I think that what we found with the with the COVID-19 is it's dug out a whole lot of different views. Excuse me. And whatever we say today can be changed tomorrow. And the other thing is what one part of the world says, another part will refute. So, and I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, this is a very dynamic world we live in. And I think we'll find that if we look back in 3 months' time at what we're saying today, we might agree or we might disagree. But what we're putting on the table today is our best information. Mm. Okay. Any comments from our fire guys on switching off fire detection when you're actually going to go and do some fogging? And we've got just on 10 minutes left for this. For this session, and then we're going to switch off. Clive or Raj?
John, yeah, look, as David was saying, you're creating smoke when you're doing the thermal fogging. So if your fire detection system is functional, it should operate. And if you don't want unwanted alarms, because people then start to ignore them. So it is something that you've got to be very aware of. And then also the different types of detectors that are installed in the building. You get heat detectors, ionization, smoke, and a vast variety of detectors. So the alcohol side of it, maybe the alcohol might not trigger it, but you could have the propellant triggering it. So at point, if a fogging exercise is going to take place, alert everybody, tell the insurance that you're going to be doing it, let them switch it off, and let the building security just be very aware that they must be a little bit more up and about, so that if they notice something, they need to shout.
Okay.
I think it's a bit difficult also because when we do the fogging, nobody's in the building. They're not allowed to because of the chemical we use. So you have to, it's like I said, you need to watch from outside. If I'm just thinking of you guys doing the fire side of it. Yeah, they need to be aware of, but yeah, there's no alarms going off when we're inside.
Typically, that is a point of concern, especially if the company doing the fogging is using flammable liquids for that purpose. And you have a fire detection system that then is switched off or bypassed or isolated, and then you proceed to, pass the fluid through. Any potential source of ignition is you risk ignition of that that flammable liquid, especially if it's in that gassed or misted state in the environment, even if it's on the surfaces. So it is a risk, and it's something that must be taken very seriously.
Okay. So one of the questions has come up is, what about the air conditioning? Should it be switched on left? Should it be switched off left on, or what?
No, we normally, it's being switched off when we do, while we do the fogging. After an hour, we normally switch it back on. We inform the companies to switch it back on, and then also the aircon gets disinfected at the same time with the dry fogger moving through the filters.
Okay. Stephen, do you want to talk about, as an alternative, what about using UV?
Yes, thanks, John. UV has been used in certain installations like hospitals, but very far away from people's eyes and far away from people's skin. So safer forms of UV is still being developed that will have a similar impact to fogging, which generally destroys the viruses in the air particles in the air. Yeah. So UV is still quite contentious and quite dangerous at present, and they are developing some UV systems that can be used throughout buildings where people are present.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I think UV is actually a much safer way to do in a building, with especially if you take fire into account. UV is much. You can't see when you do the fogging, but it's much. You can do it while in. You have people in the building to do it. I mean, it's safer that way. Where the thermal fogging, nobody's allowed in the building. Where UV fogging is like I said, it's safer and it's a wet method.
So
but with sorry, with the UV fogging, with the UV sanitation, is it not a case that with the UV light you're going to have shadow areas? You're going to have a shadow area where you won't be able to kill any COVID virus?
Sorry, you kind of the.
No, the question is, with the UV, can you get shadowing? So that where there's an area that is shadowed
Yes.
from the light.
Yeah, that is the drawback of the UV one compared to the. Just to make an example, is if you've got 5 items in a shelf in a shop, right at the back, the thermal fogger will reach the 5th item at the back, where the UV fogger will mostly reach the front too. You won't reach that far back.
So one of the other questions, David, is does the fogging leave a residual, or not?
It's like I said, it's a dry method, so you won't see it. You will feel it when you touch the surface. It's like a sticky type of thing, very light, but it's a dry method. But there is a residue that it leaves behind. Yes.
But I mean, would you advocate that it's that we rely on the residue, or is it basically a one-off type affair?
No, it's basically a one-off type. It's tested in the laboratoriums that it can last about five days on the surface. But it's like I said to most of the clients, is if somebody is contaminated and you touch the surface, you have to basically go and do a disinfect again. I know there's a chemical they're busy developing that it can last for 30 days even if you touch the surface, but we're still waiting on that to reach our shores.
Yeah, so I think that answering the question of how reliable the chemicals are would be that, that newer chemicals are being developed as we move forward.
Yeah, it's definitely. I've heard from guys using in submarines currently that's most effective, and that's the one that lasts about 30 days. Even if one is contaminated, the surface won't be contaminated. But the stuff we use here today is basically a sanitizer. You make sure the surface is clean and disinfected when we leave the premises. We get called out a lot where COVID-19 cases are, and we go in and we spray the disinfectant, making sure when we leave site, the premises is disinfected.
Okay, so I think the general comment at the moment is that sanitizing with fogging is a one-off event, and that you can't rely on any residual effect. Okay,
Yeah.
Look, thank you very much. I think let's call it off. Thank you for the questions. We've addressed some of the questions. We've also had a comment that IFMA have issued a pandemic handbook. We will, as SAFMA, take that up. Thank you, Johan. And we will see if we can lay our hands on a copy and start to share that with members of SAFMA and with the general public, or general public in the built environment industry. Thanks very much to the FDIA, Viraj and Clive for coming on and sharing with us. Thank you, David, for fogging, bringing us up to speed with what's the latest. And as we say, tomorrow it'll be even later and more up to date and as things move. And Stephen, thank you for your inputs as a panelist. And that sort of brings to an end. We've got a poll up. We'd like you to answer the poll, please. These webinars react to the feedback that we get from what's going on in the market, from what we see, and we keep them topical. So what we do is with the webinars is keep them topical, keep them relevant, and hopefully in that way keep them interesting. So thank you very much to the panelists for coming on and sharing your insight with us. And we'll call that one closed and look forward to the next one in a week's time. Thanks very much, guys, and thanks to all the participants. I hope you found it interesting, and even more to the point, I hope you found it of use. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.